temperature went beyond the 95th percentile, there was a 3% change in mortality. On the other extreme, for every degree Celsius that went below the 5th percentile, there was a 6% change in increase in
So
mortality.
it's twice as high when you drop as opposed to when you go up.
Well, it's easier to freeze to death than.
True, and your crops freeze.
Right.
Crops
That's
Now,
odd.
I forget all the
Crops freezing, I would think,
qualifications
would
that
probably do a lot
went
of the
into
livestock
those
freezing.
particular numbers, and obviously it matters. Are you looking at annual
Oh,
numbers,
yeah, staying
seasonal
inside
numbers, and
more.
like?
Yeah,
And for our present purpose,
hypothermia.
we really don't need to get into those details. The point is, a big change that comes suddenly is going to be killing people, either directly or indirectly.
And it will probably be older ones and very young ones. And
Let's
Poor
talk
people,
about
poor
disease.
people always die in 4 days.
There
Yeah, old
are
people or babies.
several diseases which, for a variety of reasons,
Swamp
have a
fevers.
seasonal pattern. Anyone want to name one?
Oh,
Malaria.
Malaria. Very good.
Cholera.
With regard to malaria,
Not seasonal though.
for the
Tends to go with your hot, dry things when the water gets
the
really nasty.
actual malarial organism to develop properly
In the
is
mosquito.
protozoan, you have to have temperatures that are in the range of 16 to 33 degrees Celsius, and the optimum is 20 to 30. And so England had malaria from time to
They
time
call it,
in this
yeah,
period.
chills and
Even
fever-
though it's
fever and
still ice
ague.
age, during the summers could get warm enough to do it. But the line
St. Petersburg
that
was
will,
badly
that
hit
is
with malaria,
going to
so-
be
Because they died like flies.
potentially
People killed
affected by
them.
malaria is going to shift with the climate.
If it gets too cold, the mosquitoes won't, hatch. So if you don't have mosquitoes, you don't have malaria.
And if it gets real wet, you get more mosquitoes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the rainfall dimension.
Well, and that affects the fish who eat the larva. If it gets too warm in the water, the fish aren't eating.
Components, but I've seen mixed statements in the literature about them. You had some plagues that were in one season, and later plagues that seemed to crop up in a different season. Virginia, do you want to comment on that?
Generally speaking, plague was worse in the warm seasons and tapered off in the winter, but this did not necessarily follow,
Not always.
not always.
Because some of the diseases would be very much related to population density. If you have 20 people in a room huddled around a fire, they're going to be more likely to pass things amongst themselves. Or if there's a housing shortage for some reason, you have a lot of people in one place.
For me,
Some plagues are very much dependent on that.
yeah, and that
for
makes
propagation.
sense.
Yeah, but if you have a dog, the rats are gonna.
1628 to
Smallpox
30.
is so bad every
The,
They
the
had
fleas
their-
like the dog better.
No matter what you're doing.
1628 to 30, Switzerland, the outbreaks were in the winter. But Marseille, 1720, London, 1665, 1625, Debrecen in 1739, those were summer plagues. I
If
think
you look at the ones that affected the Germanys in our period, the 1624-25 plague and then the 1635-36 plague, the uptick in deaths in the parish registers begins in May, peaks in June, July, and August, tapers off by the autumn.
Yeah.
And really, these geographic variations that Ivers mentions have, the sources that I've read on the subject of the winter versus summer seem to be cultural as much as anything else, because in order to be exposed to plague, you have to be exposed to the fleas from the rats. And cities that are kept relatively clean
In the summertime.
and houses that are kept relatively rat-free
No.
don't expose you to fleas and rats inside the houses. And in the summertime, you're more out and likely to be exposed to fleas coming off the dying cats, dogs, rats, whatever.
Bad
It's a matter of transmission.
Right.
the plague has to be transmitted from one place to another, and there were far more traders and
In the summertime.
cattle drovers and people like that moving in the summer.
I know, right, and London can get a winter plague for a whole bunch of cultural reasons.
If you have a tough summer, a tough winter, and you have a lot of people fleeing smaller villages because they've been snowed out, they need to go move someplace else, their houses or whatever, you could see that causing a summer plague. The climate is forcing people to move someplace else, and maybe take a disease with them,
So-
or be more packed in someplace.
Yeah, and then in Switzerland, I can see, I know in the Switzerland and the Black Forest and those areas, when it gets cold, they bring everything into the house. So everything with disease comes into the
Well,
house.
most of the peasants in that day,
Well,
your livestock lived underneath and you lived up top.
No.
And a lot of them they did.
No.
Depend,
The
again,
Black
depends on
Forest they
where you
did,
live,
and
depends
parts
on
of
where you
Switzerland they
are.
did, but not.
That, again,
Yeah.
it depends on where you are.
Exactly.
Some places, that's true.
And
Other
some
places
places
it's
it
not.
is
Okay,
not.
so we
Yeah.
talked about disease, and there are some other diseases we can mention, but I'd like to move on. Agriculture. The temperature and rainfall variability that you see has really dramatic and frequently adverse effects on agriculture. Pfister, I don't know if he's the same one that has defined these little ice age effects, and essentially March, April, if it's cold, reduces forage for the animals, etc. July, August, rain.
Yeah, drought.
Affecting, limiting the harvest. September, sort of, and October, sort of a double whammy. If it gets cold early, the animals are brought into the barn, etc. And the rain interferes with sowing. It reduces nitrogen content in the soil.
Or it
and
could
thus
knock down a
creates some
whole-
problems
a
for
whole
the next
crop,
year.
yeah.
So these he defined as little ice age effects, and even drew this little graph.
But it
here.
had to be prolonged for more than just 1 year for it to have a dramatic effect on
Well-
population migration or even
Well,
numbers.
okay.
Sustainability.
When you were talking about famine, you had a bad harvest 1 year. That was usually survivable. When you had bad harvest because food could be brought in from elsewhere, you may have stores. When you had 2 or more years of bad harvest, that's where you started to
Migration.
see the famine
You had a lot
effect.
more migration in
You
those
see,
times.
It's not.
Actually.
It's not just those times. Look at the Dust Bowl in the 30s.
Sure.
Okay.
You had migration plenty there going out to California.
There's a-
Right, exactly, because they had how many years with no crops
Almost
whatsoever? Yeah.
now we can follow prices of agricultural crops and
They
see
also live a
some
little
of
less
these
close to
effects,
it.
but you have to
But it
be
has to be-
careful.
it has to be-
Because some of them, the price of, what was it, rye went up, I think, in the 1630s in one of the areas I looked at, but that's been attributable to plague and its effect on the labor for harvesting and all the other agricultural activities for bringing the crop in, as opposed to a little ice
But
age.
in that time period, say the 1630s, it was quite warlike. You had a lot of coalescing events that created population downfalls as well as migration, not just crop failure. You had intentional destruction out there, as well as diseases that were
But
coming
that's
in
kind
from
of
the
a
Far
chicken and
East.
the egg thing, people are hungry, so they go to war, and they
Yeah,
go
it's
to war, and
exactly
it
right.
makes them hungry. So,
And well,
That
and you
wasn't
have some of
necessarily
these
due
other
to
effects.
merely crop failures. It was the Anglo-political society of its time. You had a lot of fiefdoms that were very much at each other's throats.
Fiefdoms. Not. Oh. Fiefdoms is
I do think that
it's too late for fiefdoms.
the 30 Years' War started when?
Yeah, fiefdoms is way medieval.
Call it 1621.
So they've had 12 years of people rampaging back and forth. I'm sure that would increase morbidity and mortality.
Just got another way.
If you didn't hear Virginia,
Everybody
she
listen
said
up.
1618 to start.
Okay. Yeah, but you've had 15 years of intermittent violence that would, your crops could be ruined, your family could be burned out. So it would have, I'm sure, increased.
But Eric put the Ring of Fire in 1631 because it hadn't gotten that bad yet.
The worst thing that had happened.
Kind of depended where you lived, didn't it?
Well, yeah.
If you were from
I would not have wanted to be in Magdeburg.
Right,
Yeah.
Magdeburg, it was
The
pretty
worst thing,
sucky.
the worst thing that had happened in the
To that point.
to that
Yeah.
point was the massacre of Magdeburg.
Yeah, but you had the armies marching.
And those armies just stole everything that wasn't nailed down because they didn't
And they had a
have,
scorched
they did
earth.
not
It
have
was,
supply
well,
trails.
They did
it
not
wasn't
have
scorched earth, it was
No, it
called,
wasn't
it was
scorched earth.
called foraging.
All
They
right.
were feeding
But bear
themselves.
in mind that we're looking now at the entirety of Europe and even to a lesser degree in other parts of the world, where I haven't really spoken about it much other than, a little bit at the beginning. And the armies, there were particular routes that the armies tended to travel back
Because
and forth a
because the
lot.
road was easier that way, or the
Yeah.
horses,
Those
the
areas, I
artillery
imagine, would show much more of those
degradation.
effects than some of the other areas where no one had much reason to march. So I'm not sure, particularly at this time period, that we want to project that as being, a pervasive effect. It
Where do you
certainly
get your
is a fact.
temperatures from anyway? I'm really dying to
Oh,
know.
I've been wanting to get.
Because nobody even had a thermometer yet.
And I'll get.
So
let's
I'm
talk
kind of
about
curious
that
where we
now.
get
Tree
where
ring.
temperature readings.
Let's
Tree
talk
ring.
Good,
about
good,
that now.
good harvest, bad harvest, I can
Let's
see
do
that.
that. Let's talk about that
It's called
now.
water frozen, water thaw.
Okay.
Water
Yeah, but that's
frozen,
very
water-
crude.
The first, while there was a very primitive temperature and thermometer in existence, it was a specific gravity type thing, totally impractical for any, as other than a scientific curiosity, I would say.
There weren't very many of them
The-
either.
And,
Because I think they were
well,
developed about that time.
there were, the
Galileo's
thermometer developed pretty soon after
Yeah.
our time
Torricelli?
period. But
Couple
the
there.
first good, the first good instrumental records were in England, 1659, and there you actually have a continuous series, pretty much first from 1659 for temperature. Now, of course, that has to be taken with a grain of salt because they not only were the thermometers themselves less sophisticated, they had no concept of calibration, and
You mean they weren't
had-
NIST certified? Oh my goodness. They were fire date out totally.
The modern approach will specify where you put your thermometer. It's so many feet above the ground, so you avoid the microclimate effects. It must not be in direct sun, and so on and so forth. And actually, there have been attempts to work with some 19th century records where they've attempted effectively through comparing series from, the fort here and the fort there and doing various manipulations to try to normalize the data to get a better instrumental record. But obviously, when you only have one record, you really can't do very much. There are more of these records developed later on, but yes, in 1630s, no instrumental record. So what
Not in
people
Europe,
do,
but in China they had something.
they did not have a thermometer.
They didn't have it
being
in-
used to
as an
create
instrument
the
that we can-
temperature records in China.
that we
in
can have numbers.
1630s.
But they had a way of measuring it in China.
I don't remember them having a
I
thermometer.
don't remember them having, but any